Saturday, December 17, 1927, started out like most other winter days on Cape Cod, bleak and gray, and a winter storm was brewing. By midday, the Coast Guard station at Race Point, Provincetown, had the red storm signal flags whipping in the wind. For Lieutenant Commander Roy K. Jones, it seemed the perfect opportunity for performing some maneuverability testing on the ship under his command, the U.S. Navy submarine S-4. The USS S-4 was commissioned in 1919. She was 231 feet long and had a surface speed of 15 knots. On the day of December 17, 1927, she had 2 observers, 4 officers, and 34 servicemen aboard as she put out from Provincetown to run the measured mile course off Wood End. After cruising surface for a few miles, Jones ordered diving stations, and the S-4 began her first run of the measured mile course at periscope depth. The sub was closely monitoring her instrumentation for accuracy during the testing, while using her 2 periscopes to sweep the area for any craft that might penetrate the boundaries of the measured mile course. After completing the test run at about 3:35 p.m., Lieutenant Commander Jones ordered the periscopes housed in preparation for surfacing, and the S-4 began planing upward toward the surface. While this was going on below the waves, upon the surface, the Coast Guard destroyer Hiram Paulding was patrolling the waters off Cape Cod for illegal activity, namely rum runners. Her skipper, Lieutenant Commander John S. Perilous, had been given his patrol orders verbally, as was normal procedure at that time, and the Navy was not informed that the Paulding would be steaming through the area. After spending many miserable hours in the whipping wind performing her surveillance tasks and taking note of nothing suspicious, at around 3 p.m., after rounding Race Point, Perilous ordered the Paulding back to port. She next approached Wood End and was heading for the docks just past Long Point. At 3:35 p.m., just as she entered the beginning of the measured mile buoy zone, at about 75 yards off her bow, the quartermaster spotted a splash of white. It was the feathery wake of the S-4's periscope. With only seconds to make a correction, the quartermaster and the pilot house yelled,
"Hard astern, full right rudder!"
But it was too late. Within seconds, the sub emerged under the Paulding's port bow. The cutter tore a gash in the side of the sub. The men aboard the Paulding watched in horror as the sub resubmerged below the gray, churning waters. Perilous marked and buoyed the position and then sent a message to Boston.
Commandant, Navy Yard, Boston. Rammed and sank unknown submarine off Wood End Light, Provincetown. Paulding.
Back aboard the S-4, a torrent of seawater began flooding the torn-open battery room, moving its way through the vessel. The batteries were flooded, and the engines went dead. The men in the control room, including Lieutenant Commander Jones, were able to shut its compartment door and seal it, effectively securing them in an airtight bubble within the sinking sub. The depth gauge began to descend. 80 feet, 90, 95, 100, finally coming to rest at 110 feet as the S-4 settled upon the murky, silty bottom of Cape Cod Bay. Jones, realizing the battery room in front of them was flooded, and the torpedo room in front of that offered no retreat for the men in there, ordered the compressed air turned off to other parts of the ship. Suddenly, water began pouring into their compartment from an overhead ventilator duct that led to the flooded battery room. The men tried to stave off the flow by closing a valve to the duct, but it was not budging, and water continued to flow into the control room. They had no choice but to retreat into the narrow confines of the engine room. Unknown to Jones and the other men now relocated in the engine room, the 6 men up forward in the torpedo room, including Lieutenant Graham Newell Fitch, had also slammed shut and secured their door against the torrents of water flooding the sub. However, they were without food, heat, and light, and unless rescue was swift, they had little chance of survival. Boston Navy Yard sent out wires to Portsmouth, New York, and New London. Submarine reported sunk at Wood End near Provincetown by Coast Guard destroyer, Rush. The salvage ship Falcon immediately set out from New London with various other tugs and ships underway to the site. The weather was also getting increasingly more foul. Just as the ships were heading to the site, the Boston Yard put in a call to Chief Gunner's mate Thomas Eady at home in Newport, Rhode Island. Eady was a decorated diver, having received the Navy Cross for his heroic rescue efforts in another recent sunk submarine off Block Island. Eady was also personally acquainted with many of the crewmen on the S-4 and could only imagine the torturous situation they were undergoing. Eady, along with a crew of other divers from Newport, arrived at Provincetown at 12:30 a.m. on Sunday, December 18. Bad news travels fast, and the town was buzzing with anxious relatives, newsmen, officials, and onlookers. By 8 a.m., the Falcon finally reached Provincetown, delayed by the rough water conditions. Diving preparations began aboard the Falcon. It was now 10:15 a.m. and 28 degrees atop the water. It took many hours on the rough seas to secure a safe position for the Falcon above the sunken sub, and by this time it was nearly 23 hours after the collision. Eady began his descent into the frigid Cape waters, as everyone on the surface wondered if anyone could possibly still be alive below. And within hours, many along the East Coast and further would be anxiously monitoring the horrific event. By 1:50 p.m., Eady had made his way through the murky waters to the sub and believed he heard an echo, a ring of metal against metal, coming from within the sub. He continued to search and work his way around the vessel as the pounding became more distinct. Eady had a hammer with him and tapped on the hull. From within came an answer. There was yet life aboard. As he came to the hatch directly above the torpedo room, he heard 6 sharp taps, a pause, and then the signal repeated. Morse code. He continued to inspect the rest of the vessel by tapping his hammer, but found no other signs of life. He suddenly realized he was numb from head to foot, and wondered how the men in the torpedo room could possibly survive these circumstances very much longer. Back in the sub's torpedo room, the men huddled in the freezing darkness, wondering if they were going to be rescued. They couldn't hold on much longer. Hours passed. It wasn't until later that afternoon that they finally heard sounds coming from directly outside the hull. The men clanged a wrench against the hull and were answered in turn with tapping from outside. Aboard the Falcon, the decision was made to blow the sub's ballast tanks in hopes of forcing her to the surface. This time, another diver, William J. Carr, was sent down into the frigid water in hopes of securing a compressor air line to the ballast tank. He was able to secure the line, and the compressors above started pumping air into it. Air bubbles were immediately seen on the surface, and it was evident that the sub was severely compromised with fatal leaks. It was now 4:40 p.m. on December 18. Carr was finally brought up, nearing exhaustion, and a new dive team was sent down. Also about this time, the USS S-8, sister ship to the sunken S-4, arrived on the scene. The men aboard the S-8 could grimly imagine how the men aboard the S-4 were doing. As one of her officers put it, "It's mighty cold down there, like the inside of an icebox. It's pitch dark, and their only light is an emergency lamp. They have no food and probably no water. As for oxygen, they may have a couple of tanks, but not enough for very long." The S-8's radio room was able to use her oscillator to ping down a message to the S-4 in Morse code. It said, "Is there any chlorine gas down there?" From within the S-4, a message was tapped back. "No, but the air is very bad. How long will you be?" The S-8 then asked, "How many are you?" The S-4 replied, "6. Please hurry." By 8 p.m. that Sunday evening, through tumultuous storm conditions, the diver, Chief Torpedoman Fred Michaels, was finally able to secure an emergency airline to the compartment. But in the process, he himself became entangled in the lines, and the Falcon had to send dive help down to retrieve him. By 9:30 p.m., the still exhausted diver Eady was back in the water. He found Michaels, face down against the hull of the S-4, his airline fouled up as a jagged piece of metal sliced away at it. In the course of freeing Michaels, Eady's hands went numb, and he also became victim to jagged pieces of razor-sharp metal that cut into his wetsuit as well, allowing the frigid water in. By the time both men were hauled to the surface, they were near death, if not from their wounds, from the torture of not decompressing properly. After hours in a recompression chamber, it was decided that the Falcon had to take Michaels into Boston Hospital if he was going to survive. Thomas Eady was afterward honored for his role in saving Michaels' life. Thomas Eady received the Medal of Honor from President Calvin Coolidge on the 23rd of February 1928. They briefly left the scene, but the Falcon was back again by late Monday afternoon, December 19th. There was still no reprieve in the weather, though. and diving conditions continued to worsen. It was impossible to send any more men down to the sub. All that could be done for the men below was to answer their infrequently tapped-out messages. Earlier that Monday afternoon, Lieutenant Fitch in the torpedo room had tapped out. "How is weather?" The answer came down. "Choppy." The sub again tapped out. "Is any hope?" The reply came from above. "There is hope. Everything possible is being done." Throughout that Monday night and into the following morning, the men on the Falcon waited for better weather so as to resume their rescue efforts. The Falcon radio pinged messages to the sub below from their families above. One such message to Lieutenant Fitch on the sub said, "Lieutenant Fitch, your wife and mother constantly praying for you." The message was repeated back many times, but no answer came. Finally, at 6:20 a.m. Tuesday morning, December 20, 63 hours into the ordeal, one last message from the sub. It was the last message to be received. It wasn't until January 4 that divers were finally able to cut their way into the sub and remove just 3 of the men. After careful inspection, it was later indicated that none of the men aboard had been alive except Fitch and the others in the torpedo room during Edie's initial descent on Sunday, December 18. Recovery of more of the men continued over many weeks. It was not until the 17th of March, 1928, that the S-4 was finally brought to the surface with the aid of pontoons and towed to the Charlestown Navy Yard. It was here that Lieutenant Fitch and the holdout men in the torpedo room were finally removed from the sub. But the men of the S-4 would not die in vain. After the boat was reconditioned and recommissioned, she became a test platform for experiments with submarine rescue operating out of Key West. She was decommissioned in 1936. The legacy of the USS S-4 endures as both a warning and a tribute, a reminder of the risks taken by those who work in the deep, and a quiet salute to the bravery shown in the face of tragedy. For United States submarine veterans, the S-4 is more than a historical episode. It embodies the steadfast spirit of the men and women of the silent service, bound together by duty, sacrifice, and the sea that has shaped their lives.